next person who's going to speak to us is Ben, and Ben's from Redhill, and he's going to talk about makerspaces and thinking around that. So Ben, I'm really excited for you to be sharing with us today. Thank you for hopping in and for putting your views across. So thanks.
Thanks, Karen. Thanks very much. I hope you can hear me out there.
Yes, we can.
Great. Okay, so I'm just going to share my screen and then I'll kick straight off. Let me just pull it up.
Thanks so much.
Okay, select window. Right, now for something completely different. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm just going to see if I can make that screen a little bit bigger. Let's just, oh, sorry. Apologies. Okay. Right, so let's get started. I wanted to talk to you today about makerspaces and thinking about makerspaces. It's one of those things that have gained a lot of traction in the last couple of years. It's, I think, been wildly understood and misunderstood as well. So I want to dig a little deeper in there and talk about the different parts of makerspaces and why you should get involved in one. When I was a student, I really couldn't wait to finish school and get home to something I was working on. I always had a project on the go at home. I had a circuit I was working on, something I was like, I want to build. My dad was the same. He's always disassembling something on the dining room table, much to my mother's consternation. So I come from a place of makers, and I've always been thinking about making, and I mean, I so love the way that now education has changed to bring in practical learning. So some of the observations I'm going to share with you today are taken from our PBL program. We have a PBL program that runs at my school, and we have been running it since, well, me not personally, but it has been running since 2014. So in conjunction with that, and additionally, we also run a subject called computational thinking. It is based really around taking, schools always talk about how they want to teach programming and coding so that they can get the skills that are the byproduct of learning coding and programming. And Redhill's taken a slightly different approach. We said, why don't we teach the byproducts that we want, like algorithmic thinking, decomposing, abstraction, all these fancy buzzwords. Let's teach them overtly, and let's use coding and programming to bolster those observations and those techniques. So we teach those two programs, and this is where a lot of our makerspace and that sort of thinking crops up. So those are two of the things we run, and two of the things I'm going to use to base my assumptions on today. But a small disclaimer is that a lot of these things are not backed by any studies. These are things I've observed in my classroom, and these are a couple of things I've tested. We've had a lot of latitude to run different programs and to try different things with our students. And I'm going to tell you about a couple of wild things, like we don't do grades. So we don't take marks from our students. And when I tell teachers that, they're always like appalled. They're like, but then surely the kids don't do any work. And that's not true. The kids do plenty of work. They really dig and they really get into it. And I start to feel that sometimes actually marks actually maybe destroy the learning. But I don't know. That's maybe a discussion for a different time. So I'm going to move into the first slide now. And I wanted to talk about, firstly, and all you IB and PBL thinkers out there, the why, is always more important than the how. So let's talk a little bit about the why of makerspaces. And I've really grouped it into two areas. And I'm going to take a traditional African invention, the creepy crawly, that put millions of poor boys out of work. A small invention that really changes every man's life, well, and woman as well. So now this is a South African invention, and I'm going to use it as the context to explain why we think makerspaces are important and why you should have one and why you should encourage your students to make and be practical. So if you think about the person who invented the creepy crawly and about them working through their research and development. So at night, tinkering in their workshop or putting together the prototype, various PVC pipes bolted together, probably not the beautiful piece of design we see in our pools today, but something slightly more ugly, but functional, something that would have worked, proof of concept. So once no doubt to put together this prototype and the proof of concept would have taken some time. Time coupled with that, once it had eventually been prototyped, it'd have to go to production. Now, to take it to production, you'd have to take the actual prototype and you'd have to make molds. We're talking in excess of hundreds of thousands of development here. Not only partnered with the time that you spent making this, but you'd have to spend a lot of money getting your first unit off the production line and into the hand of a customer. Now, that's a large barrier to entry. Somebody may not want to go through even the time that it took to do that research and development. They may not want to go through hundreds of thousands of rands they took to maybe they took a loan out in their house. I don't know. Maybe they got a whole bunch of funds from a friend. Anyway, they would have had this large barrier to get into this market, to get that first product off the production line. And that barrier no longer happens in Makerspace. We can print a creepy crawly on a 3D printer, much like the 3D printers you see behind me working now, for a couple $1,000. So Makerspaces have allowed us to take away that whole research and development, take away that whole barrier to entry, and get our students in there to try something for a couple $1,000. And if they fail, so what? It's a couple $1,000. But if they're successful, the skills they glean from it are just as valuable as the person who produced that first 100,000 Rand creepy crawly. So that's incredibly important. It gives our students a realistic, simulated, real view of production for a couple $1,000. Secondly, right, we all know that students learn by doing. We know it. Teachers know if you get the kid to do something, instead of reading about something, they infinitely learn quicker, and the learning curve is steeper. But have we taken a step to think why? Why did they learn so? Why is practical learning so much more important? And if you think about it, and I see it happening in our PBL program, when we allow kids to tinker and we allow them to play, when they take an action and then they get feedback and then they iterate, that loop is incredibly short in Makerspaces. The feedback is instantaneous. They don't have to wait a couple days for a test to be marked. They don't have to wait feedback to come from a teacher. Instantly, the minute they do something practical, the feedback is there straight away, and they can iterate and improve. It means their learning curve is much steeper, and they can move much quicker. So this practical learning gives them a real avenue to double step, increase the amount they learn in that practical space. So those two things for me, that instantaneous feedback, that minimizing the feedback loop, as well as getting rid of that research and development, means that our students can get real world experience in our Makerspaces for a couple $1,000 with minimal tools. All right, so next I'd like to talk about how this happens in the commercial world. I think by not preparing our students for a Makerspace type environment, we also are keeping them from one of the sort of major commercial movements that is happening today in the maker world, and that is called open source. And it's based on that first idea I talked about, the fact that if we can get rid of research and development, we get rid of that innovation, we can almost get rid of we can get rid of patents, because people don't have to spend that money to protect their work anymore. They feel not so protective over it because anybody can do it, anybody can make a printer, anybody can print the parts they need. So I'm going to take you onto a open source community now. Okay, this is called the RepRap. And I have to say that slowly, RepRap. RepRap stands for Rapid Replicator. Okay, that's quite a mouthful, right? RepRap is a community project. It was started, I believe, by a biologist. Now, a biologist who had the view that perhaps he could make a machine that could print itself and evolve as it prints itself. So quite a biological thought there. And this is where that lovely synthesis comes in. That biologist met a group of makers, and they put together the first machine, which they dubbed the Darwin. You can see it in the top left-hand corner of the slide there. It's a sort of square made out of a lot of thread. Most of the stuff is easily available in a typical hardware, or you can find it just about anywhere. Their first Darwin machine was the first RepRap they produced. Now, the thing with the RepRap community is once you produce one printer and they make changes, you can just print off the next version. You're not hindered by the fact that you have to pay for a new version. Everything is easily available and can be downloaded and then printed. So what a lovely idea. You can make a machine, you can hack together a machine, they call that a rep strap. You can print your first version, your Mendel or your Darwin. They're all sort of named after biologists or biologic themes. And the minute somebody makes a change, you can print the new version. Now, I don't have to tell you there that once again, we can see that feedback loop happening again. And it's so quick. It's so quick that the iteration means the RepRap community has produced a large amount of printers, and you can see them all pictured there. And in fact, the one on the second row there is one that was produced by a South African called Quentin Harley. I think it's the RepRap Morgan. So now, if you have a community of people where anybody can put ideas in, then your community is strong. And by having those patents and that large research and development, and it's difficult for people to get involved. Now, if I think about this model and I think about the RepRap community and people working, volunteering and adding their time and putting their thoughts in and having comments about it, right? And then I think about a company like Apple or Microsoft, which are wonderful companies. There's nothing wrong with those companies. But if Microsoft can only employ 1 million people, then it only has 1 million brains at its disposal, 1 million voices, 1 million ideas. But if I can put it on the internet and I can make it free and anybody can put their voice in, then how many people can get involved? Well, sky's the limit, as many as you can think. The ideas just flow and they just come in. That research and development is just happening all the time, and you're iterating all the time, and your product is just infinitely better because nobody slows it down. It just continues and it's easily available and anybody can pull it down. So innovation these days seems to be free in certain communities. And I would hazard a guess that maybe Microsoft and Apple might be slightly worried about these open source communities. They can move at a speed that they just can't. So that's how it would implement in the real world. And our students need to be aware of these communities and how they work. We need to prepare them for this. We need them to be able to think like this. And they do. They are charitable and they are looking to put their ideas out there. So I wanted to just show you a picture of our lab and just to tell you that we put our money where our mouth is. Right, so this is one wall of our makerspace at school, and there is a small printer over here which we picked up for about 6,000 Rand. It came as a kit and we had to put it together. This is Josh. Josh spends a lot of time in the makerspace. I don't want to say sneaks out of class because that's not very good, but he gets away from time to time and often comes in and tinkers and builds one or two things. We use that printer to print the parts to create this larger CNC. Let me use the pointer here. This larger CNC over here. CNC is, you can basically think of it as a drill that moves around and can cut various shapes, any shape you can draw out of a piece of wood. So there's a lovely flow here. Tools make other tools. A 3D printer that prints the parts for a CNC that cuts a frame that makes a new printer, and so the cycle goes round. You only need one tool to begin, and anything can be printed. And once again, the CNC is an open source design designed by a German chap called Ryan, and the design is just beautiful. And that's because people have been allowed to put their ideas and they've iterated quickly. It can be printed at home. So we spend a lot of time making these sort of tools, and there's a beautiful community that also happens around these sort of type of spaces. Josh's dad came in the one day. He said, "Wow, I love what's happening here. I'm an aeronautical engineer. I need something printed." I said, "Well, I don't know if we have time to print it, but I can help your son make a printer that he can take home, and then he can print the parts for you at home." And that's exactly what Josh did. We used our printer to print another printer that he took home and his dad's was printing a couple parts on. But I made his dad promise that if you take it home, you've got to pay it forward. You've got to make sure you print another printer for somebody else. And once the new model comes out, you could just print the new model and you're never out of date. Innovation and ideas are free and they get put back into the community. So I'd like to also just digress for a moment. Just talk a little bit about resources and resourcefulness, because for the last couple of minutes, I've talked about all the different tools we've made, and no doubt there are people out there who said, well, we don't have access to these tools. We're not able to make them. We don't know where to start. But there is one thing I've noticed during lockdown, that certain parts of lockdown have been very good in terms of increasing creativity, and specifically to do with tools. I'll show you what our project looked like during lockdown just now. But I just want to talk about tools and resources just for a moment. So I've put together a little graph which may look complicated at first, but let's just look through it together. Right. So on this graph, and I believe this is a parabola. I hope there's no math teachers out there who would disagree with me. So a parabola, and I'm basically following the red curve there. On the horizontal, I've plotted resources, So how many resources or tools you have at your disposal. On the vertical, I've plotted resourcefulness, how resourceful you can be, right? And now if we look at that red curve and we look at increasing the resources, so you start with nothing, but you get a brand new tool, and so your resourcefulness increases and you move up that red curve and you get better. And then you get perhaps another tool and you get slightly better. But what happens at the top of the curve, right? As I add more resources to you, your resourcefulness diminishes, right? Your creativity disappears somewhat. The law of diminishing return kicks in and you start to become less resourceful. So resourcefulness doesn't relate to how many tools you have. It's how resourceful you can be. We see people on the side of the road making things out of recycled materials all the time. They will just create whole sheeps and amazing sunflowers and recycled planes out of cans. So people can be incredibly resourceful. And I'm sure you saw that during lockdown and how students would put things together. And maybe even in your classroom when you're putting your things together. So don't always think you need all these fancy tools to get started. You just need a space where you can have a passionate teacher or somebody who really wants to do this and a couple of inventive students. You just need to start with one or two things and that will get you going. It's about resourcefulness. It's about a way of thinking. If we're making a poem or we're putting together an essay, right, as long as we do it in a maker way, it's still makerspacing. You don't have to be involved in the best 3D printing and cutting things out of CNC. It's lovely to get there, but take it slow and just find a space where you can get started. Right. Next, I'd just like to talk a little bit about what we did during lockdown, and just take you through it step by step. I'm not going to give you a blueprint because I'm not a big believer in the fact that blueprint should be given to other schools, because your PBL, your IB journey, or whatever you're going on is deeply personal and it relates to your students and how they work, and you need to adapt as you go through and work through what you'd like to do. But I'm going to just show you, I'm going to just take you through starting from the bottom and working up. I've put a book on the right-hand side. We were deeply influenced by Josh Kaufman, The First 20 Hours. Now, it's on the other side of outliers, of the 10,000 hours rule. If you need 10,000 hours to do mastery, Josh Kaufman reckons you need 20 hours just to do it pretty good. Right. So he mentions things like heart surgery. Okay, maybe that's a little bit far-fetched, but you can learn anything in about 20 hours with focus practice. And that's what it comes down to. Focus practice means that when you do something practical, you get feedback straight away and you can iterate, and your learning curve is much steeper. So we wanted to set up a program where the feedback was instantaneous and where students could iterate quickly and adjust. So we put together this flow in terms of what we wanted to do. And we started with saying to the students, what would you like to learn with your 20 hours? So we gave the students that driving question and we said, right, you've got 20 hours, put together something you'd like to do. We allowed them to put together 3 proposals, which they would give to us in writing, and we'd say, we very much like proposal 1. Proposal 2 is not so good, work on proposal 3. So we'd instantly give them feedback. We would assign them a tutor, and that tutor we call a panda, and that panda would work with them every 2 or 3 days in lockdown. Have a meet with them, meet with a couple students, look at some of their pictures, see their project log, their portfolio of evidence, which we just called the reflection document. So we'd go through this weekly review and we'd give them that assessment and that feedback as we work through on the different proposals. And so each week they'd put together their 20-hour review, their portfolio of evidence. And then when we got to the end, just to mention to you, when we got to the end, we decided not to do a formal assessment so much as a rubric. We wanted to give just constructive feedback on their reports. So we wanted to say, Ali did this really well, but she struggled in parts to be able to collect the resources. She maybe needs to work on her referencing. So we wanted to give just written feedback, no marks. But we also wanted to look at assessing their self-assessment. So we looked at taking their assessment, getting them to self-assess their portfolio of work. Then we'd look at the portfolio of work, and then we'd assess the difference between the two. So by doing that, by assessing the difference between our assessment and their assessment, we could gauge how good they are at self-assessing. And self-assessing and being able to self-reflect, one of the most important skills you can learn for this new generation, being able to gauge how good you were. And it's so interesting to see these kids are brutally honest with each other, and they know when they're goofing off, and they know when they could have put in good work. And then sometimes they're just not honest enough. And it's always about getting that, engaging that, and getting them to self-assess themselves. So that was
sorry, so you've got about 30 seconds, but that's been amazing. So
great.
If you want to wrap up.
Yeah, great. I was going to put up some reflections and just talk about these are just a couple sentences I took over their reflection document, their portfolio of work, and hence, sorry, I didn't correct the spelling errors if there's any in there, because I know how students don't often use the spell check. But just a couple ideas of students and how they mentioned and different sort of things they pulled out of their reflection document, and then just a couple of publications that I mentioned in my the Make website is great if you want to start and have a look at the Makerspace playbook. It tells you how to set up a Makerspace from scratch. 20 hours. Josh Kaufman, something that's definitely influenced our work. The Maker Manifesto tells you how to be a maker. It's like the Bible for makers. So if you want to get started there, those are 3 good publications you can have a look at. Okay.
Thank you, Ben. That's so cool. So as a design and technology teacher, I just love what you say. So giving children the reason, they've got to know why they're making it. And for me, that was just such a wonderful thing to see in the classroom, where the children have a reason for what they're doing. They just come up with such amazing ideas rather than you saying, okay, you got to do this. I think it's just so important to do that. So to say thank you to Ben, we'll be sharing some of those notes, but for me, that's really incredible how we actually get children to think, how we get children to think out of the box, to work with their hands, work with technology, and combining it all together. I think that's just what we should be doing in the way that we teach.